I am Steve Joordens, Professor of Psychology, University of Toronto Scarborough.
Big question, of course, but as a professor of psychology, what do you identify as the main differentiating characteristics of an intrapreneur and the thought process behind that?
Yeah, well, I mean, in my case, for example, I'm very passionate about teaching, but I really believe that students need to learn, yes, the content of the course, but also they need to be able to develop their skills. They're critical, what we sometimes call transversal skills, like critical thinking, creative thinking, communication skills, collaboration skills. And I firmly believe those skills are only developed through repeated, structured practice. So I had a challenge a few years back of how can I, with my very large classes, I teach about 1,600 at a time, how can I give students the kind of practice with these skills they need to develop them? And so I think that started my maybe intrapreneurship mentality, where we started actually trying to imagine, could we build a tool of some sort? Could we use technology to sort of challenge that problem? And I think this is what every entrepreneur kind of does, looks for some, problem in need of a solution, and then goes about trying to create that solution. And so many years ago, we created something called Peer Scholar, created it for my class, did a bunch of research on it because that's what we do in universities, and kind of honed it with research. And then suddenly it became in demand outside of my classroom. And so that's what kind of took us from the step, I think, to doing something for me, and kind of seeing the bigger picture and seeing that what we'd created had value at a much larger scale.
Now that we have some kind of a sense for what intrapreneurship means,
Yes.
what do you think is its value inside an organization? Do you see any risks or any disadvantages? I mean, one thing I can imagine is that if all of your employees in an organization are intrapreneurs, perhaps at one point you might be worried that they could take over.
And I don't even know if that would be a good thing, because if we kind of imagine that we have a bunch of, let's call them traditionalists that are doing things in the traditional way, which is sort of time tested, and then you have a few, people like me that are trying to do some crazy different things. I don't know if you want too much of that going on. I think in a university, the student body would react. They've learned to tolerate my experimentation and see the value of it. And so I think it's good to have a few people like me that are kind of, there's a term sometimes used, kicking the hive, doing things in a different way, looking for creative alternative approaches. But I think there's a very specific mindset to that. You have to have a certain amount of risk tolerance. You have to be able to do damage control really quick, because when you try new things, it creates damage. And so I think having a few people like that in an organization are really good to get it kind of seeing where those boundaries are and where the traditional approach could be improved. But I think also it's good to have a core of traditionalists that are kind of, steadying the ship as a few people maybe rock it a little bit from the sidelines.
Well, that's a great distinction. So let's hone in a little bit on both. Let's start with the benefits of having intrapreneurs or entrepreneurs within an organization. What are those for you from the top, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, often it's, we have this term of fresh eyes, that sometimes it's good to have, fresh eyes on your work. And I think entrepreneurs kind of have that mentality all the time. They're always kind of looking at the current state as something that could be improved upon, and trying to imagine in very creative ways different directions than the direction most commonly taken. And so again, I think that's sort of like, the scout of a monkey troop or something. Somebody who's kind of trying the different avenues out, and then ultimately saying, okay, I tried out 6 things and maybe 5 of them didn't work as well as I hoped, but this one really is great. And so I think it gives you that pushing of the envelope, which sometimes becomes a competitive advantage for an organization, that if you have competitors doing what you're doing, it's very important to be at that next step ahead. And I think it's those intrapreneurs that can take you that next step ahead and differentiate what you're offering from what some of your competitors may be offering.
Would you say that intrapreneurs are perhaps better suited for specific roles within an organization? If so, which?
Well, I don't know how idiosyncratic this is. I know myself well. I don't know the whole class of people like me. I do know that to some extent, just to say sort of ironically, within a more traditional organization, I don't think I am a good leader. I'm not sure you want your leader being the one trying these 5 different things all the time while other people are sort of, watching. I think a leader needs to be steady and maybe more of a traditionalist and maybe the one that weighs these innovative approaches. Whereas I think somebody like myself, is more, this person in the trench trying out all these different things and getting excited about some and not others, and then informing the rest of the community about that. So I think it's more, you're always, I think, a little bit more on the fringe because you're not doing things the way everybody else is doing things. And I think that's okay. It gives the intrapreneur a little bit of freedom as well, to sort of do things their own way, but ultimately they want to come back. And so I think the role is that kind of rebel of a sort, and not always totally appreciated, because there is a rebel with a sense of, we could be doing better, which sort of casts a hint of judgment on those who are doing it the current way. If you think, well, current way's okay, but we got to up our game. Sometimes these people are a little annoying, and yet I think sometimes they also succeed in literally raising the ship and helping everybody. So it's a funny role, but it's a fun one as well.
What do you see as the risks, basically, of having maybe too many intrapreneurs within an organization?
Yeah, I think to some extent these intrapreneurs are defined by being risk tolerant. They're willing to do things in a different way. In my case, even with a 1,600 student class, you're willing to add a twist that could, of course, blow up in your face. And if there's a small group of people doing that, and if the people they're interacting with all understands, and so in my case, for example, a lot of the educational tools they see in my class have gotten there from previous innovations, so they kind of see the value of what I've done, and then I'm adding something new that could blow up at any time, and I think my students almost see the excitement. If that's a class a student encounters that way, then I think that's kind of exciting and interesting. If it was every class, I think there's a certain anxiety that comes with people experimenting with you and playing with how they do things. And so I think, yes, there's risks involved with it. There's also huge benefits. It is like every entrepreneurial investigation. I don't know how many small businesses start compared to how many succeed, but same with these ideas. You have to have a lot of ideas before you have one that has a lot of good traction, which means you're exposing the organization to some ideas that don't go anywhere. And that's okay on a small scale, I think, for the benefit of those ones that take off. But yeah, if it were on a large scale, I think that's a whole lot of risk for most corporations or most institutions to take on. And so it's pockets of innovation, I think, are the way to go in a lot of these cases.
To put it simply, I suppose the key role of a leader is to get people to follow him or her within a certain direction. And so if there are too many people that are there to rock the boat or disrupt that direction, obviously that's not going to work.
Yeah, and I think another example we can think of that kind of relates to it is if you think of, advocates, there's so many things to advocate for in life, from, animals' rights to women's rights to minority rights. You can think of all, and most of us can't, if we had 6 different advocates in front of us, it would just confuse us and we wouldn't want to listen to any of them, even if they had good structured arguments. I think it's the same way with these intrapreneurs. We are the people out there saying, hey, look at this shiny thing. We could do it this way. This is really cool. And I think an organization can tolerate 1 or 2 of those people and consider their ideas deeply. But if it was 8 of those people, I think it would just be too big of an ask to kind of think through all these new ideas that deeply. And so I think that's part of the reason why, the ratio has to be right. And that person has to be willing to be, I don't want to say not liked, but sometimes not having them thrusting their ideas on people. People don't always enjoy that sometimes, and so they have to be willing to kind of understand the dance that's involved in innovation, and some of the friction that's involved in that dance as well.
Given the pros and cons of intrapreneurship within an organization, as you have described them, what must leadership do to navigate, basically, on the one hand, promoting intrapreneurship where it's needed, but also keeping that balance between intrapreneurs and, I suppose, more conventional teams?
The leader does have a very important role in a couple of ways. So first of all is giving these intrapreneurs some space to breathe and to work. And what I mean by space is maybe to operate outside the traditional norms of how you judge somebody's progress, and literally allow them to do things their own way. But also I think to insulate the rest of the group to a point, to the point where that intrapreneur really has come up with something that really seems to have value. So I think, the leader maybe watches and is engaged with what's going on, but isn't too quick to kind of import these ideas into the more traditional structure until there's an idea that sort of seems proven and seems really, really good. And I think then the leader, so it's almost back to that point where, we can't listen to everybody advocate for their great idea all the time. But once we know an idea has legs, once we know it has merit, I think the leader can be the one that kind of says to everybody else, listen, you can ignore that person for now. But I'm not going to ignore them. I'm going to listen to them. And when I see that there's something really cool here, then I'm going to come to you and say, hey, there's something really cool here. It's time we listen to this idea. And I think that can, ease some of the frictions and can play that role where the leader is keeping the ship going well while also keeping an eye towards, future directions that could be promising, could be those differentiators we were talking about. And so, yeah, I think that's a critical role.
Final question. If you had 30 seconds to pitch to someone in a position of power, the prime minister, academia, industry leaders, your students, of course, or anyone you want, to cultivate a culture of intrapreneurship in Canada, who would you pitch and what would you say in 30 seconds or less?
Yeah. So, I do think would be the government. An interesting side thing is I have my 1,600 student class now doing a work integrated learning project with the Ontario provincial government to try to give them some ideas about e-learning. And so this is my attempt to do exactly what you're describing, I think, to pitch in a sort of sneaky way to these people who ultimately who currently, at least in Ontario, are considering how the optimal future e-learning system would be. And if we can get some good ideas to them and Ontario embraces it, then maybe it can go broader than that. A lot of people will claim that online learning is sort of a poor substitute to face-to-face learning. And I think in some cases that is true. There are things you can do in a face-to-face context, like real-time human interactions that are critical, and students need that somewhere. But I also think there's a lot you can do online, especially with skill development. These skills are the core of entrepreneurship: critical thinking, creative thinking, and communication. If I had to list just three, and like any skill, nobody plays guitar they're not born playing guitar. They have to spend time in structured practice to develop that skill. And so we need to look for solutions and processes that bring that structured practice into the education system, preferably not at the university level, but at, say, the grade 4 level or the grade 5 level, and from that point on, so that this just becomes a natural part of what students are doing and learning, and it makes those skills just second nature for them when they need them most, when they're out there looking for a career.